The sea beneath the dinghy was growing shallower. First, the faces of the wading islands appeared above the waves, and then their shoulders. Oliver looked down through the clear water and saw mermaid villages clustering on the silvery sand of the sea floor. The islands set their huge stony feet down carefully, picking their way between the huts and fish farms. Iris peered down too, trying to spot people she knew. Merfolk were darting in the shoals between the island's feet, but Iris was too short-sighted to make out their faces. Ahead, some of the isles had stopped, a crowd of great stony heads rising from the water. Their voices boomed across the sea, exchanging greetings and stories of their travels. "Look!" said Oliver. In the midst of the waiting isles stood the Thurlestone. There was no mistaking that towering outline, with the stolen submarine right on top. The islands around it were all casting wary, envious looks at the fine wig. Iris flapped the dinghy closer. A fire was blazing among the trees on the Thurlstone's top. Now and then a small, cavorting figure was silhouetted against the flames. The sound of drumming echoed across the water. There was no sign of those dangling glass globes. Oliver felt awfully afraid. He remembered what Cliff had said about the Thurlstone's liking for blood. Was that why Stacey de Lacy had captured his parents? Perhaps he was hoping to impress the other rambling Isles with human sacrifices. "I have to go and find them," he said. The only answer was a snore from Iris. Tired out by all that tail flapping, she had fallen asleep, draped over the dinghy's stern. Oliver did not try to wake her. He could see that she was far too exhausted to help him free his parents. He pulled her into the dinghy and tucked a blanket from his rucksack over her. He looked around for Mr. Culpepper, but the albatross had flown off to talk to some of the gulls which wheeled in white clouds around the other rambling isles. Oliver scrawled a note to Iris on the inside of a caramel bar wrapper, then quickly stripped down to his special explorer's pants. He snapped on some goggles and a pair of frogman slippers, which he found in his rucksack, and dived into the sea. He struck out quickly towards the Thurlstone. Crowds of merpeople and shoals of silverfish darted beneath him, but they were all far too busy and excited to notice him. The Thurlstone's rocky head towered up into the darkening sky ahead of him. On its black sand beach only the surf moved, but up on its top he could hear sea monkeys cheering and squealing, pounding on stone xylophones and sealskin drums. Oliver swam and swam. He was a good swimmer. He needed to be after all the shark and crocodile and piranha-infested waters that Mr. and Mrs. Crisp had made him swim in. But the Thurlstone did not seem to be getting any nearer. He realised that it was moving again, shuffling its way right to the front of that crowd of giants. A little cold finger of panic trickled Oliver on the back of his neck. He looked back. He had already swum a long way. He was shivering slightly, and although the Hallow Shallows might only come up to the knees of rambling isles, Oliver was still far out of his depth. He thought for a moment of shouting for Iris, but he wasn't sure what might happen if the rambling isles or the merpeople heard him and realised that a human being had come to their sacred seas. Just then he noticed that the little cold finger tickling him wasn't panic. It was an actual finger, and it belonged to an actual sea monkey. He yelped with fright as the creature doggy-paddled round in front of him, grinning madly. "Eep!" it said, eyes blazing with reflected moonbeams. It grabbed Oliver by the wrist and started pulling him with it through the water towards the Thurlstone. For a moment Oliver struggled, fearful of capture. Then he looked again at the monkey's grinning face and changed his mind. It was trying to help him. "Eep!" it said again, and with an answering "Eep!" another monkey appeared, sliding over a wave top and seizing Oliver by the other wrist. They chatted to each other, kicking their powerful little legs, hauling him forwards through the water. In ones and twos they seemed quite cute, he thought. Perhaps they weren't such bad creatures after all. Perhaps they just wanted to play. A third monkey appeared, then a fourth. The Thurlstone was definitely drawing nearer now. That rowdy party was still going on up above, but from nooks and crevices in the island's shore more monkeys were jumping down into the surf and swimming out to see what their friends had found. Their small hands stroked and prodded Oliver. They added their strength to his, and he surged through the waves closer and closer to the Thurlstone's beach. And then, all of a sudden, there were too many monkeys. They all wanted to play with Oliver, and the newcomers began to squabble with the ones who had found him first. Some climbed onto Oliver's head, some wrestled his right flipper off and clung gleefully to his toes as he kicked and twisted, trying to dislodge them. He started to feel as if he was swimming in wet green fur instead of water. Monkeys were using him as a raft, scrambling up onto his shoulders and crowding on his head, forcing him under. A scrabbling, squabbling ball of monkeys surrounded him as he sank, and they were so busy taunting and fighting and teasing each other that none of them had stopped to wonder if the boy in their midst could breathe underwater. Down and down they went, while Oliver kicked and punched against the kicking, punching monkeys. He felt his other flipper torn off, then his goggles. Strong little arms tugged him this way and then that, so that he was afraid they'd pull him to pieces if they didn't drown him first. At last, with a wild jerk, he jackknifed free of them and struck out blindly, leaving the monkeys to swirl and tumble behind him, not realising yet they had broken out. The Thurlstone's flank was a dim, dark wall in front of him. A deeper darkness showed in it. Oliver swam in, thinking it was a cleft that might hide him from the monkeys as he clawed his way back to the surface. In fact, it was the opening of a narrow cave. Oliver remembered all those cracks and fissures he had noticed in the Thurlstone's side when it first rose from the waves. Hollow, rotten to the core, that's what Cliff had said. The passage was too narrow to turn round in, so he swam on. Heart pounding, eyes bulging, sure he was about to drown. He clawed through winding, stony passages until at last he came up, gasping for air at the centre of a flooded cavern, through a shaft in the ceiling moonlight, slanted, shining on the rippled water. Drums and monkey chants came down too, but softly, as if from high above. Things brushed against Oliver's legs as he trod water in the middle of the cave. Weeds? Or tentacles? He thought of the squids and octopuses that had clung to the Thurlstone's eyebrows. Was this where they lived? Panicking a bit, he swam to the side of the cave and pulled himself out onto a stony ledge. Behind him the water slopped and gurgled. He imagined disappointed monsters sinking back into their depths. An opening in the rock wall led into another passage. This one was dry, and moonlight came down it. He crept along it. It sloped steeply upwards, round, like a stone throat. Weeds and ferns grew from the walls, and he used them as handholds while he climbed. Iris woke up suddenly. "Oliver?" she said, sitting up in the dinghy and looking around. Night had fallen while she slept. Moonlight and starlight silvered the sea. The dinghy rose and fell upon a gentle swell. "He's gone," said Mr. Culpepper, swooping down to land on the side of the dinghy with a beak full of sardines. "He left you a note." Iris looked around and saw the note that Oliver had left tucked into a gap between the bottom boards. "What does it say?" she wondered. "How would I know?" said Mr. Culpepper. "I'm an albatross." Iris peered at the letters with her short-sighted eyes. "Gone to the Thurlstone. Back soon. Love, Oliver." "There you are then," said Mr. Culpepper. Iris looked up. Even she could see the Thurlstone, with the watermill balanced on top of it. "But what about the army of monkeys?" she said, flapping her fins about in agitation. "He'll be taken prisoner just like his mum and dad." She launched herself over the dinghy's side and dropped with a splash into the sea. It felt good to be in the warm, scented waters of the shallows once again, skimming over the silvery sand, flashing past the feet of rambling owls. But halfway to the Thurlstone she collided with a shoal of mermaids who were heading busily in the other direction. "Oof!" said their leader. He was a fat merman, and he was annoyed at being head-butted in the belly. "Watch where you're going, can't you?" "Sorry," said Iris. "I'm on my way to the Singing Rocks. Yes, yes, come on," the merman snapped. And before she could say that wasn't where she was going at all, Iris had been swept up in the excitable shoal of young mermaids. They were all done up to the nines, with polished tails and starfish in their hair. Each carried her comb and mirror. There were a few who Iris knew, the very ones who used to laugh at her short-sightedness. "Where are we going?" she asked as they bustled her along. She hadn't been much more than a mer-baby on the last night of the Seawigs, and she wasn't entirely sure what it involved. "We're off to the Singing Rocks," one of them said, "to sing our songs for the rambling isles. Mermaids always sing on the night of the Seawigs, remember? Come on." "But I can't sing," Iris protested, trying to turn away. They grabbed her hands and dragged her with them. "Of course you can," they said. "This is no time to be modest. Come along." Up and up Oliver went through the maze of the Bad Island's empty heart. It was not like climbing through a person's insides. That would have been horrid. Everything seemed to be made of stone. The only thing that told Oliver he was inside a living being was that sometimes when he set his foot down or grabbed an out-jutting bit of passage wall, the whole lot twitched. The Thurlestone was ticklish, it seemed. Oliver tried to use only the weeds and ferns as handholds once he'd worked that out. Not all of them had deep roots. Twice he nearly fell, while leaves and clumps of rooty earth went tumbling down the shaft to spatter into the black pool where the squid and octopuses were waiting. Tentacles crossed, hoping that he'd fall, but Oliver was a good climber. All the mountains and crags and lost temples he'd climbed with his mum and dad had made sure of that, and before long he was at the top. He crawled out of a crack in the summit of the Thurlestone. The water mole and the other shipwrecks loomed over him. Monkey drums boomed and stone xylophones clattered. The monkeys were having a wild old time, dancing round their fire, toasting sea anemones on sticks and painting glasses and moustaches on the old stone heads. None of them noticed Oliver as he crept like a damp ghost between the trees. Soon he reached the temple. Outside its great stone entrance was a pool, and on the pool the 2 glass globes that held his parents floated. Mr. and Mrs. Crisp were asleep, huddled in the bottoms of the globes, which clinked gently against each other from time to time, like wine glasses. "Mum!" called Oliver softly. "Dad!" They did not stir, poor things. They were just as exhausted as Iris after all their adventures. "Mum!" he shouted, wading into the pool and banging his fists against the globes. Still, his parents did not wake, although Dad rolled over and muttered something in his dreams. But someone had heard Oliver, a voice from behind him. "Ha!" He turned round. There stood Stacey de Lacy, with his army of monkeys around him. Some of them were still beating their drums and banging their xylophones. One held a tray of biscuits, another a cool drink for Stacey, and 2 others fanned him with big peacock feathers. The rest were just bibbling about like mad wind-up toys, full of excitement at all the mischief that lay ahead. "You," said Stacey de Lacy, pointing rudely at Oliver. "So here you are, come to thieve and sneak and spoil my plans." "I just want my mum and dad back," Oliver promised. "Well, you can't have them," jeered Stacey. "The Thurlestone needs them. They are the finishing touches on his wig. They could make all the difference. They're just the sort of thing that will make him stand out." "But why do you care so much about the Thurlestone winning?" Oliver asked miserably. "Ah!" said Stacey de Lacy. "We've got a deal, me and the Thurlestone. If I help him win the Seawig thing, then he'll help me. Imagine the power I'll have with this great big giant at my command. And the other rambling Isles will follow the Thurlestone when they see his wonderful wig. The winner of Seawig's night is a sort of king. They'll have to do as he says. We'll stomp New York, smash London, sit on Shanghai. The whole world will tremble before us. Nobody will dare say I've got a girly name by then." "But you have got a girly name," grumbled Oliver. "Monkeys!" howled Stacey de Lacy. Oliver tried to fend the monkeys off, but soon he was pinned down under a gibbering heap of them. Meanwhile, some others had gone rushing into a side chamber of the temple and reappeared bowling a 3rd glass globe. Some held it steady while the rest unscrewed its lid. Then Oliver was monkey-handled into it, and the lid screwed shut behind him. Stacey de Lacy grinned in at him, his leering face stretched out of shape by the thick glass. "Now the Thurlestone's wig is finished," he chortled. "Not just 2 stupid crisps, but the whole set." Tittering with mischief, the monkeys rolled Oliver away. Mr. and Mrs. Crisp had been woken by the noise and were sitting up inside their globes, watching sadly as their son was trundled past them. "I'm sorry," mouthed Oliver through the glass. A reef of dark rocks rose from the hallowed shallows, and the waves breaking whitely against it. Wet stones shone in the moonlight. The mermaids scrambled through the surf and up onto the reef's rocky ledge. There they sat, each with their comb and her mirror, and her long hair blown sideways on the breeze. Their plump choirmaster bobbed like a seal in the waves and clapped his hands to the mermaids. "Attention. Just time for a quick practice, girls. Sing up." So they sang, and their voices blended with the voices of the sea and wind. All over the hallowed shallows, the rambling Isles forgot their nervousness and listened. Up on the Thurlestone's head, Oliver and his mum and dad heard that song, and it sent shivers riffling down their spines. They couldn't listen for long, though. They were busy being rolled across the Thurlestone's summit by those monkeys and dangled over its edge. Stop, 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 the fat merman shouted, clapping his hands over his ears. The song of mermaids was meant to sound strange and unearthly, but not this strange and unearthly. Someone's singing flat, he said, glaring at the row of singers. Iris knew it was her. She blushed deep red. The merman stopped her and pointed. You, sing for me. Iris drew a deep breath and sang as loudly and sweetly as she could. An awful strangled note emerged, so piercing that the nearest mermaid's mirrors cracked. Stop, stop, the mermaid shouted. What a disgraceful racket! What were you thinking of joining our choir? With a voice like that, be off with you. Iris started to explain that she hadn't meant to join their choir at all, then decided that there wasn't time and splashed back into the sea. She couldn't imagine why she had wanted to find her way home to all these silly mer people. Her new friends are much more fun. All she cared about now was rescuing Oliver.